Welcome back for all of our listeners, and we're happy to have you here. This is the Parents Solution, your one-stop shop for all things educational. Today, I have a guest with me. Dr. Courtney is an educator, a researcher, and a policymaker who is dedicated to helping the education profession. Matthew began his educational journey as an elementary music teacher, and he now assists schools in order to help students by using educational research and data to drive continuous improvement in school districts, schools, and classrooms. Matthew, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to have you today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Maybe it's a good idea if we, for our listeners, kind of contextualize like your experience a little bit. I always like to be able to make sure that we know like where people are coming from. Do you want to talk about maybe your experience as a teacher? I think that's probably a good place to start.
Yeah, sure. I started my career teaching elementary general music,
Mm-hmm.
so little bitties up through fifth grade. And absolutely loved my time in the classroom and loved my time with kids. And in 2014, my school was consolidated, and I had an opportunity to transition into more of a school improvement and support role, really thinking about how do we help schools streamline processes, do things a little, I like to say, smarter, not harder, and make better informed decisions for their kids and their classrooms, and improve teaching and learning across the board. And so that's the journey I've been on since. I'm really thinking about how do we use and leverage research and data to really drive continuous improvement and make better decisions for all learners.
Mm-hmm. I think that's amazing. I think that oftentimes what happens, I know for myself anyways, what I've seen in my experience is that a lot of the higher educational professionals, policymakers and whatnot in particular, the people who make those sorts of decisions don't really have a whole lot of experience per se in the classroom. So I think it's amazing that you bring that to the table, that you have that experience, because I feel like that is going to really inform your decisions that you're making, right?
Yeah, it really does. And being able to stay connected to the classroom, even now that I'm out of the classroom and have been for a while, always being able to do classroom visits, being able to go in and work with teachers one-on-one and talk
Mm-hmm.
to them about what's happening in their experience really does help inform my decisions as a policymaker, my decisions as a consultant and as a trainer and as a researcher. It's really important to stay connected to the classroom level.
Mm-hmm. I would 100% agree. If only everyone had that sort of mindset, I think the world would be much better off. Various states and provinces would be much better off. What sorts of
Mhm.
things did you notice in the public education system that weren't really effective or that needed changing, that kind of drive most of your decisions and most of your issues that you bring to your team today?
Mhm. Yeah, so when I left the classroom, what really motivated me to shift into the school improvement mode was sort of the haphazard way that I saw leaders making decisions about what was happening in our schools. If you think for a moment about just the volume of information we have about education across the globe, the volume of research literature, the just insane volume of data that teachers collect every single day on their kids. And I was really frustrated by the lack of data use and research use by the leaders who were over me when I was in the classroom, and that I saw when I looked across the education landscape. And so, I felt like as a teacher, we wasted a lot of time doing things that weren't working. We knew they weren't working, but we kept doing them anyway because we spent a lot of money on it, or no one wanted to admit that they were wrong, or the contract hasn't run out yet. So we got to run the contract out and then we can try something new. And that is just really not a very effective way to make decisions and to teaching and learning. We have so much information. We need to learn how to use that and leverage that to make better decisions the first time. And that's what I try to work on now.
Mm-hmm. I really like how you pointed out like that really resonates, like, oh, we had to stick with it because of X, Y, Z, right? We paid for the program, we have to use it, right? Well, we this is the way we've always done it, right? Like nothing's wrong.
Mm,
Why fix something that's not quote unquote broken? Right? Just
yeah.
because it's not split directly in two doesn't mean it can't still give you a sliver. Would
Yeah.
be my analogy for that. I love how you pointed that out of not being afraid to make those changes that are necessary, even if it requires more work on the front end. If it's going to give your students better results, then isn't it worth it? Right?
Yeah, and I always say continuous improvement is called continuous improvement for a reason. It's supposed to be an ongoing process. And so it does take a dose of humility to be able to say, yeah, we made this decision. We thought it was going to do X. It really did Y. Are we happy with that? Can we improve that? And even thinking about stuff that is currently successful, everything can always be better. Everything can
Mm-hmm.
always be, every experience can be richer. Every intervention can be more effective. And so really that mindset shift is so important to have the humility to say, look, I don't know everything that's going on. This might be the wrong decision, but here's why I'm making it. I know why I'm making it, and I'm willing to change in the future to continually improve teaching and learning in our school.
Mm-hmm. What a growth mindset. That would be amazing if more people had that attitude, just like in general, like in life, but
Yeah,
also
yeah.
also with the education system, right? Because when you think about the public education system in particular, it's not really changed much, right? Like as a structure, as an institution, it's not really
hmm
changed much
hmm
since its sort of implementation, right, within society. And so trying to ensure that we are doing what we can to give a quality education, I think is really important. Now, whether that actually happens or not is a different story. But my point here is that I think you're really making an effort to make a difference. And I think that's really, really important because a lot of the policies and even like the curriculum that I look at these days is, and I know you're not in charge of curriculum per se, but even the curriculum that I look at these days is like some of it's not been updated for like 20 years or like 15 years. I'm like, why are we teaching 15-year-old curriculum, right? If people had that
hmm
mindset of like, okay, this is a good curriculum, but how can we make it better, right? This is
hmm
working, but like what things can we improve on, right? Do we need to check our facts? Do we need to change some research? Do we need to add some data? Those sorts of things, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think, as we kind of evolve as a profession and we start thinking about education as more of an evidence informed field, best practice changes over time because there's
Mm-hmm.
teams of researchers thinking all the time about what we're doing and how those pieces of best practice really evolve. The example I like to use when I was in my teacher preparation years ago, we learned about learning styles and that there's three learning styles and each kid is in one little box and you got to do surveys and activities, figure out what kind of style each kid is and teach to that. And at the time, people thought that was the best practice. But what we know now, after many years of research and investigation into that, is that yes, there are learning styles, but they're really more like preferences. And I have the ability to learn across all modalities. I might prefer to learn with one modality over the other. And so maybe that helps with other aspects of like maybe classroom management or things, paying attention, things like that. But that I have the ability to learn in all three modalities and maybe even some more modalities that expand the learning styles theory. And what I find when I go in and I do training and work with teachers that a lot of them just don't know that. They don't know that was taught and presented to me as this like very concrete theory of learning, right? But
Mm-hmm.
what a lot of folks don't realize is that it has evolved and changed. And it's just a matter of kind of rethinking how we think about education around professional development and learning and growth so that we can be more evidence informed. What does the research today say about the practices that we're using today?
Mm-hmm. And how can we make those practices better in the future is always, I think, the idea,
Exactly.
right? Now that doesn't mean like everything in the name of progress. Like I'm not a person that's like throw everything to the wall and see what sticks, right? You do want to
Yeah.
come at things from a reasonable and a logical perspective. But I think that always looking at it from a perspective of like, okay, how can we make this better is something that's really, really important for sure.
Research out of the Carnegie Foundation really shows us that incremental intentional change, that's really where it's at. That big sweeping change, that spaghetti against the wall metaphor that you use, that really doesn't stick for very long. You throw the spaghetti against the wall, it eventually slides down. It's that intentional, evidence informed decision making that really leads to lasting change.
Absolutely. And so I have to ask, because this is kind of like your job, what sorts of policies and types of like policies and curriculums decisions are you making that you feel are genuinely making like an impact on people? Or maybe like the
Mhm.
topics if you can't talk about the policies themselves in specifics.
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm doing a lot of work on is thinking about how we embed research use into policy and practice. So thinking about, we're going to write this policy on pick a topic, any topic, and how are we using the research to inform what that policy really says? How are we really making sure that this policy change is in the best interest of kids and learners right now, based on the research and what we know? And that's a huge lift because you have to be able to quickly inform and educate a wide variety of audiences about what the research says around a policy decision. So think about all the people who are involved in policy decisions. You've got elected leaders, you've got appointed leaders, you've got your civic leaders like your school board members, your superintendents and building principals, you've got parents and parent groups, you've got teachers and teacher groups who all have these differing levels of understanding of research and application. And so that is sort of a needle to thread that I don't know that we've really figured out how to do great, how to really take research and inform, yes, my decision when I put pen to paper and start writing a policy, but also all the other policy mechanisms and steps that go into play. How do you embed research into all of that? So that's a really interesting and fun kind of space to play in right now, and something that I don't know that we've really figured out a great way to do it.
Right. When you're looking at research, I think it's important to look at all the different aspects of research too, right? Kind of going off on a little
Hmm.
bit of a side
Hmm.
tangent here, but you want to look at all the different sources, right? I like nobody, and I remember when I was in school, when I was doing my BA and then later my BEd, nobody, like no professor would have accepted an essay that I would have handed to them with like one source on it, right? Or like two sources on it.
Hmm.
Or even
Hmm.
three. Like you were expected to have like upwards of 15, 20 sources, right? And there were certain
Sure.
professors required certain requirements and things like that, right? So making sure that you're pulling information from accurate sources too, and from a variety of sources. And you're right, making decisions that are intended to be, or that hopefully are, in the best interest of the student, because that's really who we're
Mhm.
trying to serve, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I
100%.
think a great example of that is like curriculum adoption.
Hmm.
And when we're going into a school to purchase, and a school needs to purchase a curriculum, and I think schools need curriculum. That's an important role, because a teacher can't physically create all the stuff they need every year, right? So we have to purchase some things. I also think that teachers need some flexibility to be able to create and iterate and innovate. But that base curriculum is a really important element. It helps teachers a lot. But when we purchase those curriculums, are we looking at the research that informed the curriculum and the development of the curriculum? Has the curriculum been piloted? And is there research or data that says that this curriculum is successful with a group of kids like the ones in my classroom?
Hmm.
One thing I always challenge people to do is push back against your vendors. So the vendors come, they've got their shiny little one pagers with little graphs on them. And if you look carefully, my favorite thing to find in vendor materials and marketing materials are graphs with no numbers or words, because they're not even graphs. They're just like graphics that look like graphs, but they don't actually tell you anything, right? So I always say push back against that. Ask for the research. And, and I'm not the first person to ever talk about the importance of research. Your vendors should know that you're going to ask that question to be able to provide it to you. And if they can't, you need to walk away. I have a great example. I was doing a workshop with a group of district level leaders. And in the workshop, I asked them to bring marketing materials from various vendors that they were either currently negotiating with or considering, and then we looked up the research. And I taught them how to find the research, how to read and interpret it. And then one of my superintendents through the workshop found that the vendor had straight up lied on the marketing material and said that cited a source, said that the study showed positive, statistically significant outcomes. And so we went and looked it up, and that vendor, we called their bluff. That vendor didn't think we were going to look that citation up, but we did, and they did not tell the truth on their marketing form. And so that superintendent got up, went out in the hall, called and canceled the contract negotiation right in the middle of my workshop. And that's such a simple thing, but it's something that in the busy, hectic day-to-day life, we just take people's word, right? We don't think about, do I need to verify this? What does this citation really say? And that's an intentional habit of research use that we have to cultivate and build across the profession.
Hmm. Also, I mean, checking your sources too, right? Making sure that everything lines up. I, for one, like when I was, writing my papers and stuff and essays, I would always make sure I never ever bluffed on like a bibliography or whatever. Like I was down to the letter because you never know. Like, yes, I'm one of 375 students in a classroom, but what happens if the one citation that I use that's not accurate is the one that my professor decides to look at and I'm the one random paper? Like, no, it's just easier to be honest, right? It's just
Mhm,
easier to be
mhm.
honest because then you don't need to worry about getting caught. You don't have to worry about like what else you need to say or like make up a story, right? And I think you're right. I think that that's, I mean, regardless of the vendor themselves, like I think that that's something that we as humans, yeah, in the busy day-to-day life, like we're like we just assume good intentions, right? Oh, why would someone lie to me about something like that? Like, why would you do that? Well, you have to think about the motivations. Well, maybe they want you to buy their product. Maybe it wasn't even intentional. Maybe that was given to them by a supervisor, right? But you never
Mhm.
really know the other person's intention. So I think that it's really crucial to make sure that you check that stuff out, to look at that stuff. I'm actually in negotiations with a curriculum development at the moment as well, so that's, I mean, this is a good conversation to have. You always want to ask the hard questions, right, and ask those sorts of
Yeah.
um uncomfortable questions, right? But if you want the answers, then you have to ask the questions.
Hmm. Yeah, we have this phenomenon in education. I like to call it over the fence decision making, where we look at the district next door or the school building down the road and see, like, what are they doing over there? And then we kind of just say, oh, well, it worked for them. It might work for us. But that's really haphazard, right? We don't actually know what's going on in that other school. We don't actually know the other, conditions that surround the implementation of that intervention. Maybe do they hire full-time staff that you can't afford to hire? That's going to change the way the implementation works. Maybe it's a behavioral intervention and their guidance counselor is also a licensed clinical pediatric psychologist. That person's bringing some stuff to the table that you don't have in your school. And so being able to go back to the research literature and really understand what makes a particular intervention work or not work with a population of kids like yours is so, so important.
Mm-hmm. I really think it's a game changer. So speaking of
Mm,
kids, because we've been talking about kids and what sort of things and those sorts of issues that we face as adults trying to help our children. This
yeah.
is the parent's solution. What would you, as a policymaker, like from a policymaker's perspective, what would you say to parents that are listening right now who are interested in policies, regardless of whether, it's in whatever province, whatever state, whatever area, whatever district? What would you say to parents who are interested in making changes with their own school policies or with their own school changes that need to happen?
Yeah, I think that the role of parents in school improvement processes is so, so important because parents have brilliant insight into their children. And so I always say that that conversation starts with your classroom teacher and going in and starting early on building a meaningful relationship with that person who is spending more time with your kid during the day than you probably have time with them after school before bedtime. And really building a relationship with them, helping them to understand your child and what makes your child tick. What are they passionate about? What do they love to do? What are their historical challenges and how have we overcome those in the past? Or maybe we haven't figured out yet how to overcome those. And you can work with that teacher. A partnership with the teacher is so, so important. The next sort of level of that then is to think about schools and systems and how as a parent do you engage meaningfully in improvement conversations with schools and systems. And I think that that really comes down to attending the meetings and having the conversation. When there's a public forum, make that public forum a priority. Go and listen with an open mind, and speak your truth in the assumption that they are listening with an open mind.
Mm-hmm.
In my experience, those conversations tend to fall apart when one side or the other stops listening or assumes the other side has stopped listening. And when it becomes arguing and shouting, that's when all communication, all relationships break down. The other thing I say about that is, if you can build a habit of engaging meaningfully in those policymaking meetings, in those Board of Education meetings, those community forums, your parent-teacher association, wherever it is, you make a habit of that. Then when the stuff that's really important to you comes up, you already know what to do. You're already comfortable in that environment. They know who you are, you know who they are, and the conversations flow much more collegially and with greater respect.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to say, like, when the important issues come up, I mean, I know there's different issues in every district and across, whatever province, whatever state, there's always different problems that come up, right? And some
Yeah.
are very specific to certain areas. But I think that's very good advice. Like when you make a habit of getting involved with the small things, right? And then you're walking through the door for a big parent meeting, a parent teacher meeting, or whatever it might be about, some sort of big decision that's like a curriculum thing that, let's say, you're super passionate about, or something. You're much more likely to
Mhm.
be listened to if you've and respected, and worked with, and made sure that your voice is heard, and hopefully that can be taken into account. Right. Rather than if that's the first time that they see you is when it's something that's like super passionate, that you're super passionate about, or that's,
Mhm.
in your books needs to be changed, etc. Right. If you make a habit of getting involved right from the beginning, I think that's a very solid, you're building a solid start, to be able to become
Mhm.
involved in the more important things.
Yeah, and I think sometimes those public meetings, every public meeting is different, right? And they have their sort of rituals, they have their regulatory, like, do I have to sign in? Do I have to sign up to speak? Can I just get in line? There's lots of procedural things that facilitate any kind of government public meeting, right? And so if you can learn those processes and practice those advocacy skills on issues that are important but less emotionally charged, a little less passionate, then when those big topic issues come up, you don't have that added layer of frustration. I want to speak on this topic, and in order to do that, I have to go talk to Marsha with the clipboard, and Marsha's going to put my name on the list, and then Joe's going to call me, and I go to that microphone. You already know what's going to happen, and so you can present yourself better and more confidently, and you're not all flustered.
Mm-hmm. Because you're much more comfortable in the situation. I find
Exactly.
it's funny, like as adults, I think that we get flustered and we don't quite know how, like when children get flustered, they act out in very obvious ways, right? When
Yeah.
adults get flustered, they're not quite sure what to do with themselves, right? Because as adults, we're supposed to be
Yeah.
confident, right? We're supposed to know what's going on. We're supposed to have all the answers. I tell my students, like, on a daily basis, I don't have all the answers, but I will help you find them, right? And I
Hmm.
think as adults, it's about that, right? You need to know how to find the answers, or how to equip yourself with the proper, in this case, the proper tools, to be able to have those resources at your disposal.
Yeah, and I'll tell you too, I've been on both sides of the table. I've been the teacher society advocate at the microphone, advocating for something, and I've been on the other side of the table, taking that information in. And I think it's important to remember that there are real people on the other side of the table, and that they are
Mm-hmm.
also flustered, and that they are also processing in real time. And everyone is just trying to do their best to make a policy that oftentimes to make good policy in impossible situations where there really isn't a great answer, right? You just have to
Yeah.
do the best with the information that you have. And so, I think too, remembering that those are real people too.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I think about that environment is a little different. So there are certain kinds of public meetings where only the chair is allowed to talk back to a community member and everyone else has to be quiet. There are some meetings I participated in where no one from the government is supposed to talk, and we're just supposed to listen. And so parent after parent, citizen after citizen comes to the microphone, and we sit quietly the whole time. And that can be off-putting if you don't know that that's actually how that's supposed to happen, that they're supposed to be in a listening role and not a conversational role. That can be very off-putting. So that's
Mm-hmm.
another reason to kind of get involved in those environments.
Right. So that when those environments do happen, you're comfortable with them. And therefore you can speak much more confidently, right? I know
Yeah.
when I am confident and when I know what I'm talking about, I have no problem talking.
Yeah, for
When I
sure, for
don't know what I'm
sure.
talking about, I'm much more kind of, I want to listen a little bit more, right? I want to kind of point out some facts like, oh, okay, so do you mean this, this, and this, right? There's nothing wrong with learning as an
Yeah.
adult. And that goes for every situation. I think particularly if we're talking about like parent teacher meetings or meetings with like the government of some sort of educational
Hmm.
body, then you want to be able to try to meet people in the middle. But I think that's a really good point you made. Those are people on the other side of the table too. Thank you so much, Matthew, for being here. I really appreciate all your insights and feedback and all of the valuable things that you brought to this discussion today. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to reach out. You can always find me on social media. It's Star Students on Facebook and LinkedIn or starstudents.learning on Instagram. You can also reach out through email, which is all over social media channels. Thank you, as always, so much for listening, and I'll be back next week.